Jon Snow stood on the balcony of the ancient keep, his eyes cast across the rolling hills and patchy farmland that stretched to the horizon. The castle was a modest one, deep in the Reach, its former lords long fled or dead after the wars that had torn the Seven Kingdoms asunder. The sun rose over a land still bearing fresh scars, burnt fields, abandoned villages, and crumbling holdfasts. The wind carried a faint tang of ash, even though the fires had died months past. In every direction, the realm lay silent, almost expectant, as if it waited to see what new shape its future would take. For weeks, Jon had traveled the countryside with a small retinue, determined to bring a measure of order to the chaos. Most of his companions were trusted soldiers and loyal knights, though among their ranks strode a few advisors well-versed in the realm's new reality. Even Ghost padded at his side, the great direwolf's white fur tinged with dust from the long roads. Though Jon might never feel fully at ease in a lord's boots, he understood his obligation. His time in the north and beyond the wall had taught him that duty rarely came wearing a comfortable face. It had been mere months since the final battles against the forces that threatened the entire continent. Dead men walking in the far north, vying claimants to the Iron Throne in the south, and petty lords swearing fealty to one banner and then another. Now that the fighting had cooled, it fell to Jon and a handful of others to pick up the pieces. Few living souls doubted the Targaryen blood running in Jon Snow's veins. Fewer still doubted his sincerity when he spoke of unity and rebuilding. But sincerity was only the first step. After all, good intentions alone would not feed the starving or quiet the hungry crows perched on crumbling towers. He placed his hands on the cold stone balustrade. The raised, worn grooves reminded him of the ramparts at Castle Black. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling old loyalties, faces of friends lost, and the stark chill of the northern winds. But the wind at his back now was warmer, alive with scents of lavender and thyme from the fields below. In that warmth, Jon felt both relief and burden. Relief because the nightmare of the long night had ended, and burden because a different kind of war began. The war against ruin, against disunity, against the hatreds and resentments that still smoldered across Westeros. In the courtyard below, he watched men and women move about their tasks, hauling grain, tending to horses, and repairing the castle's outer walls. Some were soldiers who had survived the wars. Others were peasants or travelers seeking refuge under the Stark Targaryen banner. Their humble tasks were a testament to the realm's new priorities. Jon felt a twist in his chest, half pride, half worry. Each of these people had pinned a piece of their hope on him. He was not king in name. Titles had scattered like leaves in autumn winds. But in practice, the realm had collectively looked to him for leadership. If he faltered, they all might fall. He turned away from the balcony and walked back into the chamber. A single table dominated the center. Spread across its surface lay a newly drawn map of Westeros, marked with ink to show recent alliances, pockets of unrest, and the seats of power left standing. Across the table, murmuring quietly with a few advisors, stood Ellaria Sand. The woman who had once been known for her fiery defiance in Dorne now carried herself with a calm diligence. Though she had her regrets, many regrets in truth, she had lent her knowledge of southern politics to Jon's cause. It was a delicate business, forging trust between Dorne and the Targaryen who had once allied with Daenerys Stormborn. But necessity and a weary longing for peace had led Ellaria to become one of Jon's staunchest supporters. Jon's own heritage as a Targaryen, albeit born in secrecy, opened certain doors. Yet the Martells, who had once ruled Dorne with a certain pride and isolation, were wary of new entanglements, especially after their experiences during the reign of the Mad King and the subsequent chaos. Ellaria herself had lost much. Her love, her daughters, her illusions. But in the wake of the wars, she recognized in Jon a chance for something different, something better. As he approached, Ellaria looked up, nodding in acknowledgement. "Word has come from Sunspear," she said without preamble, gesturing to a small letter pinned beneath a stone. "They're ready to discuss the final terms of this alliance. Prince Trystane, as you know, is the last living son of the late Prince Doran Martell. In these uncertain times, he's been elevated to hold the seat of House Martell. They say that if we can secure his blessing, Dorne will fully commit to supporting your cause. Jon reached for the letter, scanning the neat script. Prince Trystane Martell, once a boy overshadowed by the memory of Oberyn and the cunning of Doran, had quickly learned the harsh lessons of war. After the horrifying string of deaths in his family, Trystane stood almost alone, his throne in Sunspear tenuous. Yet the deserts of Dorne were intact, and the Dornishmen were among the few forces in Westeros not entirely ravaged by the wars. Their support would be crucial if the realm stood any chance of truly healing. A Martell alliance could feed thousands with shipments of grain from the Red Mountain's hidden valleys and the lightly touched farmland near the Greenblood. They also boasted a fleet of capable merchant vessels in Planky Town. Even more importantly, a Martell alliance might soothe old wounds between North and South, bridging the harsh lines that had segmented Westeros for too long. He set the letter down, exhaling. "We'll leave at dawn," he said. "If we ride hard, we can reach Sunspear in less than 2 weeks. I'll meet with Prince Trystane personally. If he's truly willing to hear our case, we need to show him our respect and good faith." Ellaria nodded. "The roads are still unsafe in places. We might consider escort from House Tyrell's remaining forces, or from some of the crownlands loyal to your banner." Jon gave a measured shake of his head. "A large escort will look like a show of force or intimidation, and the Martells are prideful. Also, the lords in the Reach have their own rebuilding to do. We'll take a modest guard. I'll not march in with an army at my back. I want to show that this is a mission of peace, not conquest." A flicker of respect passed over Ellaria's features. "You sound much like Doran once did," she said softly. He believed in quiet diplomacy, in forging alliances that last through trust rather than fear. Jon only nodded, unsure how to respond. He respected what he had heard of Doran Martell, though he had never met the man himself. Strategy, subtlety, and patience were qualities Westeros needed in abundance now, especially when the memory of dragons and wildfire still haunted the realm. But Jon was not blind to the necessity of strength. Diplomacy without power to back it was a hollow gesture. If all went well with Trystane, they'd have both. The meeting ended quickly as advisors dispersed to make preparations. Jon stood for a moment at the map, tracing the route south. The Prince's Pass or the Boneway, they could take either. The desert roads leading to Sunspear were perilous at the best of times, but now brigands roamed unchecked, seeking plunder from those weaker than themselves. All of these were small battles, overshadowed by the realm's larger struggles, but if left unaddressed, they would fester. Rebuilding was not just a matter of forging new alliances. It was also ensuring that local governance and order returned. He rolled up the map, stowed it carefully in a leather case, and walked to his personal chambers. In the dim corridor, torchlight flickered on stone walls. In times past, he might have sought out advice from older, wiser figures, Maester Aemon, perhaps, or even Tormund in his blunt wisdom. But many of his mentors lay in graves or had returned to their distant homelands. Now the burden truly fell to him. Entering his chamber, Jon removed his cloak and set it aside. Ghost padded in silently behind him, amber eyes glowing in the firelight. The direwolf had never been a typical pet, more an extension of Jon's own soul, a living reminder of his northern roots. And though the rumor and truth of Jon's Targaryen parentage had spread across the realm, he still thought of himself as Ned Stark's son in so many ways. The wolf was there to remind him. "Come on, boy," Jon murmured, lowering himself to one knee and scratching Ghost behind the ears. There was no wag of the tail, no dog-like panting, just a calm presence, watchful and protective. Jon took a moment to bury his fingers in the thick white fur, letting his thoughts settle. All his life, he had struggled to find his place. Now, ironically, he had too many places, too many burdens. He had tried returning to the north, to lay down his sword and vanish from the affairs of kings, but the realm had pulled him back in, as if it needed him more than he needed his own freedom. He remembered Daenerys, the dragon queen who had changed everything. The memory still hurt. Her vision of a united realm, freed of tyranny, had resonated with him. But in the end, That vision had drowned in blood and fire. He had done what he believed he had to do, though it haunted him. Many whispered that Jon was king of the ashes in all but name, that he carried Daenerys's banner forward with a tattered corner of Targaryen pride. Yet Jon's goal was never to conquer, never to burn. He wanted to mend the realm she had helped to fracture. His thoughts lingered on House Martell, on what kind of union they might forge. If they succeeded in forging a strong tie with Dorne, if House Targaryen, through him, and House Martell could stand side by side, perhaps the rest of Westeros would follow suit. Many still remembered how Elia Martell had suffered under the Lannisters. Many remembered Oberyn's passion and Doran's careful alliances. The Martells had always been the outliers, half in and half out of the rest of Westeros. If Jon could bring them in fully, with respect and recognition, it might pave the way for a true rebuilding. He rose, lit a candle, and began to pack what few belongings he'd need for the journey south. Ghost watched him, silent as the grave. When dawn broke, golden light flooded the courtyard, banishing the shadows that had gathered through the night. Jon mounted his horse, a sturdy brown courser named Kestrel, and surveyed the small company that would accompany him. 12 men-at-arms, each clad in lighter armor suitable for travel under the scorching Dornish sun. Ellaria rode with him, wearing practical traveling leathers rather than Dornish silks. She carried herself erect in the saddle, her expression set with a determined calm. 2 of Jon's oldest confidants, men who had served him since the days of the Wall, completed the band. Ed Tollett and a tall, quiet knight named Ser Brian, who had once fought at the Battle of the Bastards. They rode out of the keep's gates, traveling down a winding road lined with chestnut trees. Villagers paused in their work to watch them go, some offering timid waves. Jon felt the weight of each gesture. The people clung to hope that this alliance would yield harvests, that the roads would be made safe, that their children would grow up in a world free of the nightmares of recent years. The North might always be his spiritual home, but he understood that all of Westeros was now within his purview. Their journey took them through the Reach, where fertile plains once laden with grain had been scorched by warring armies. Here and there, a cluster of peasants worked to replant fields, despite the blackened soil. The roads were passable, though broken cart wheels and burned-out homesteads bore grim testimony to the war's passage. Jon's company rode in silence for long stretches, broken only by a shouted greeting from a passing traveler or the barking of a distant dog. When they reached the Mander, they found a half-rebuilt bridge. Some of the stones were new, the mortar still pale, while older pieces of the structure bore the scars of siege weaponry. A watchman in battered armor saluted Jon and let them pass. Beyond lay the southern territories, each mile bringing them closer to the arid heat of Dorne. Each night, they made camp near a stream or a stand of trees, mindful of lurking bandits. Ed Tollett, ever the dour presence, grumbled at the dryness of the rations, but was meticulous in setting the watch. Ghost prowled the perimeter, an intimidating sight under the moonlight. Despite the hardships, Jon felt an odd sense of purpose. This was a journey to mend hearts as much as lands. Their path carried them through the Prince's Pass, where the air grew warmer and the rocky outcrops cast long shadows over narrow trails. To the east stretched the Dornish marches, once a site of near-constant skirmishes. Now the passes lay eerily quiet. Thorny bushes and desert shrubs replaced the verdant greenery of the Reach, and the nights came with a biting chill even as the days baked them in relentless sunshine. Ellaria guided them deftly, pointing out old watchtowers perched on ridges, each a relic of Dorne's fractious history with the Stormlands and the Reach. The tension in her posture was evident. Though she had parted from Dorne in a blaze of controversy some years before, she was returning with a new mission. Would her people welcome her or revile her? On the 8th day, they encountered their first real threat. As they wound through a narrow gorge, outlaws attempted to ambush the party. Clad in mismatched armor, desperate and lean, these men carried bows and rusted swords. But Jon's party fought back with discipline. Ellaria drew a thin blade, her expression cold and resolute as she spurred her horse into a flank maneuver. Ed Tollett loosed crossbow bolts from behind a rocky spur, felling 2 of the attackers before they could close the distance. Ser Brian rode forward, his long sword flashing in the desert light. Jon parried the blows of a ragged man with a cruel face, then disarmed him with a swift twist of long claw. Ghost leaped onto another outlaw, knocking him to the ground in a flurry of snapping jaws. The skirmish lasted mere minutes. The surviving outlaws fled into the scrub, leaving behind a single wounded man. Jon dismounted and knelt by him, pressing a cloth to the man's bleeding shoulder. "Why ambush us?" Jon asked quietly, though he suspected the answer. The man coughed, eyes wide with pain. "We've got no home, no food," he rasped. "Our lord is dead. Our fields burned. We have nothing." Then he spat, half in defiance, half in agony. Jon exchanged a look with Ed. "Where are you from?" Jon pressed, but the man only groaned, either unable or unwilling to speak further. Jon ordered the man's wounds to be tended, though their party had limited supplies. Then he released him. It was a small gesture of mercy. Jon had grown tired of killing. The man stumbled off into the wilderness, a single silhouette fading into the shifting heat. Perhaps he would survive, perhaps not. The realm was dotted with such desperate souls, and each instance hammered home how monumental Jon's task would be if he truly wanted to rebuild Westeros. They pressed on, more watchful now. On the 12th day, they glimpsed the sun reflecting on a distant structure of pale stone and domed roofs. Sunspear lay before them, rising out of the desert like a dream, the towers of the castle shimmering in the heat. White walls ringed the city, beyond which stretched the placid waters of the summer sea. Palms and citrus groves dotted the outskirts, thriving in hidden wells and carefully maintained irrigation channels. Even from a distance, it was clear that life here had not been stifled by the wars to the same extent as in the Reach or the Riverlands. At the city gate, Dornish spearmen halted them. Their captain, a dark-haired man with a gold sun pinned to his cloak, looked at Jon and Ellaria with a mix of caution and curiosity. He recognized Ellaria at once, stiffening visibly. Yet he did not raise a voice in anger or challenge. News must have traveled ahead of them, for the man inclined his head slightly, allowing them entry. They trotted through narrow streets lined with adobe walls, bright awnings, and stalls selling dates, figs, and olives. The city bustled with vendors and travelers, though it did not hum with the same lively energy it might once have had. Tensions roiled beneath the surface, but it was still more prosperous than many places Jon had seen. At last, they reached the Palace of the Sun, the seat of House Martell. The architecture was graceful, with slender minarets and shaded courtyards. A fountain trickled in the main atrium, its water reflecting the mosaic tiles that depicted coiling serpents and blazing suns. Servants guided Jon's party to a chamber where Prince Trystane awaited. Jon had last seen the prince years ago, a boy on the cusp of manhood, accompanying Myrcella Baratheon in King's Landing. Now, Trystane was a grown man of perhaps 22. He still possessed the refined features of House Martell, but his eyes seemed shadowed with the burdens of leadership. He wore light, flowing Dornish robes belted at the waist with a gold sash, and a thin band of copper circled his brow to signify his princely rank. He rose as Jon and Ellaria approached. For a moment, the air was taut with unspoken tensions. Trystane's gaze flicked from Jon to Ellaria and back. Ellaria lowered her eyes in a gesture of respect, then knelt briefly. Jon inclined his head but did not kneel, a subtle sign of his standing as a would-be leader of the realm rather than a vassal of Dorne. Trystane did not appear insulted. Instead, he gestured for them to sit on cushioned seats arranged around a low table. "Welcome to Sunspear," Trystane said, his voice calmer than Jon expected. "I have heard many stories of what transpired in the north and across Westeros. You have my condolences for those we lost." Jon nodded. "Likewise, Prince Trystane. The wars have claimed many we love. My purpose in coming here is to ensure those losses were not in vain." Trystane studied Jon for a moment. "You are rumored to be the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark," he said. "That blood ties you to Dorne in more ways than one. My aunt, Elia Martell, was once Rhaegar's wife. She died because of that alliance, slaughtered by the Lannisters during the sack of King's Landing. Why should House Martell trust another Targaryen? Jon exhaled, feeling the gravity of old sins weigh on the room. The crimes committed against Elia Martell were abhorrent, he said quietly. My father Rhaegar wronged her and the entire realm by the course he chose. If I could atone for those sins, I would. But I'm not here to pretend that apologies can mend what is broken. I can only offer you my word and my life's work to ensure that House Martell's future is secure and that no such horrors repeat. Trystane's expression flickered between anger, sorrow, and something like resignation. It is not so easy to forgive ancient betrayals, he murmured. But I also know that Dorne cannot stand alone. The rest of the realm is in chaos, fields burned and hunger rampant. If that chaos spreads further south, it will eventually consume us as well. Ellaria spoke then. Prince Trystane, we have an opportunity, she said. The Targaryen name still carries weight. Yes, for some it is bitter, but for others it is a symbol of unification. Jon Snow, as he is called, has proven his character in battle and in peace. The North follows him, many in the Crownlands, and the Stormlands would as well, given the right conditions. If we ally ourselves with him, Dorne will have a say in how Westeros is rebuilt. We can ensure the rest of the continent respects our sovereignty, our traditions, without the constant threat of invasion. Trystane seemed to consider this. Servants arrived with trays of chilled wine and bowls of olives, setting them before the guests. The quiet trickle of the fountain echoed in the chamber, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in their conversation. At length, Trystane gestured for them to drink. Tell me, the prince said at last, turning to Jon, what would this alliance look like? Do you seek marriage? A trade pact? Or is this simply a matter of pledging mutual defense? Jon sipped the wine, choosing his words carefully. He had anticipated this line of questioning. I do not wish to force marriage upon anyone, he began. Nor do I believe that a simple trade deal would suffice. We need a broader foundation, an understanding that Dorne will have a seat at the table in governance and rebuilding efforts. In return, we ask for your military support if needed, food exports if you can spare them, and the recognition that I, Targaryen by blood, Stark by upbringing, will serve as a unifying figure for Westeros. This is not a conquest, but an invitation to shape the future together. Trystane's eyebrows rose subtly. You speak as though you would be a king, yet you do not style yourself as such. Jon's jaw tightened. I have worn a crown before in the North, but it brought more conflict than peace. My father, Ned Stark, believed in serving the realm, not ruling it from above. If the realm decides it needs a king, and that I should be that king, I'll bear the burden. But my priority is ensuring we have a stable realm to live in first. Silence followed. Finally, Trystane sighed and leaned back on his cushions. Dorne has no love for the Iron Throne as it was, he said. But these are new times. If we join you, we must see tangible benefits. Grain shipments to the north, for instance, or the recognition of certain Dornish rights that have historically been ignored. Ellaria leaned forward. All that and more can be arranged. We have a proposal in writing that we can finalize. But Prince Trystane, time is of the essence. The small folk suffer, bandits roam, and winter may come again all too soon. We must act quickly. Trystane drummed his fingers on the arm of his seat, his gaze drifting to the mosaic patterns on the floor. Very well, he said softly. I will host you as my guests. We will speak more in the coming days. Dorne, too, is wounded, though less visibly than the rest of the realm. If House Targaryen, through you, Jon Snow, can help us heal our own divides, then perhaps we can stand together. With that, Jon felt a subtle weight lift from his shoulders. This was not a pledge, not yet, but it was the best start he could hope for. He inclined his head respectfully. Thank you, Prince Trystane. That night, Jon found himself in a guest chamber overlooking the sea. The air was warm, carrying the scent of salt and distant spices. Stars shimmered in a sky of velvet black. Jon stood on the balcony, arms resting on the carved stone rail, eyes on the moonlit waves. Memories washed over him of the cold nights at the wall, the wind whipping past the glaciers, of the fierce battle on the fields outside Winterfell, of Daenerys's dragons lighting the sky. Now here he was, forging an alliance that might finally bind the wounds of a fragmented kingdom. He heard a soft step behind him and turned to see Ellaria. She gave him a faint smile. "I remember when Oberyn used to stand on a balcony just like this," she said. "He would talk about how one day the world would change, that old feuds would give way to something new." She paused, taking in the night air. "He died in pursuit of vengeance, though. All that passion, all that talk of change, lost in a quest for revenge. Let's hope we can do better." Jon nodded, his voice hushed. "If I've learned anything, it's that vengeance consumes everything in its path. We need to break that cycle." Ellaria's gaze lingered on him. "You carry much guilt, Jon Snow," she observed. "But that guilt can be harnessed. Don't let it drown you. Use it to propel you forward, to make the realm a better place than it was." He turned back to the sea. "I'm trying," he said, "for all the good it will do." Over the next several days, the negotiations with Prince Trystane wore on. In a private hall within the palace, Jon and Ellaria met with Trystane, along with various Dornish lords. Small wonder, as the Martells had many bannermen, each with their own interests. Lords Ironwood, Euler, and Dane were among the more prominent voices. Each had concerns: security, trade, authority, the possibility of a revived Iron Throne overshadowing Dornish sovereignty. Jon found himself carefully balancing promises of mutual defense with assurances that Dorne's traditional rights would be respected. One particularly vocal lord, Andras Euler, questioned whether they should accept any Targaryen. "We were never conquered by dragons," he said with a sneer. "And I don't see why we should bend the knee to one now, no matter how many White Walkers he's slain." Jon remained calm under the provocation. "I'm not asking for your knee," he replied evenly. "I'm asking for your hand. We have a chance to do more than just survive the next war. We can prevent it." Slowly, the skepticism began to thaw. Lords who had been children during the sack of King's Landing no longer carried the same personal grudges. They saw the ruin in other parts of Westeros and knew that if banditry and political unrest continued unchecked, no corner of the realm, desert or forest, would be safe. Trystane saw the bigger picture too. Dorne had resources, a stable population, and minimal damage. By helping to rebuild the other 6 kingdoms, they could ensure that future battles did not land on Dornish soil. On the 5th day of negotiations, a tentative agreement was drafted. It laid out that Dorne would pledge a certain number of troops to patrol trade routes in the Stormlands and the Reach, ensuring safe passage of supplies. In return, Jon, acting under the Targaryen name, would guarantee Dornish autonomy in matters of local governance, while also granting them a seat at a new council that would oversee realm-wide reconstruction. Revenues from trade would be shared, ensuring that both Dorne and the battered regions would benefit. The agreement also stipulated that House Martell recognized Jon's lineage as Targaryen Stark, which effectively granted him a claim that other great houses might follow or at least respect. After signing, Trystane extended an invitation for a feast to commemorate the alliance. It was to be a grand affair, a statement to the realm that House Martell and this new Targaryen alignment would stand together. Servants bustled around the palace kitchens, preparing roast duck with honey, spiced lamb, citrus salads, and rare wines. Musicians practiced in the courtyard, their strings and drums echoing through the corridors. The city itself seemed to buzz with curiosity. Jon, however, found little time for celebration. He walked the corridors with Ellaria, discussing how best to relay the news to the lords in the north, the Vale, and the other regions. They would have to move quickly to seize upon this momentum. A single, bold stroke could crumble if left neglected. Letters would need to be sent by Raven, and messengers dispatched on horseback. The slightest rumor or twist of the story could undermine everything they had gained. He recalled how swiftly rumors once spread that he was a turncloak at the wall, or how easily stories about Daenerys swaying between benevolence and madness circulated. Westeros was a realm fueled by half-truths and gossip, and trust had worn thin. Meanwhile, Ellaria confided her concerns about her own standing in Dorne. Despite Prince Trystane's acceptance, Many still viewed her as a woman who had led Dorne astray in the pursuit of vengeance against the Lannisters, culminating in conflicts that had nearly destroyed House Martell entirely. She sighed, her dark eyes troubled. To many, I am still the paramour of the Red Viper, the woman who let her grief rule her. But I want to do better. I want a Dorne that is safe, secure, and equal. Jon offered a comforting look. Your knowledge and connections have helped get us this far. In time, the Dornish might see that your actions now outweigh your past mistakes. We all carry scars. That evening, the feast commenced in the Palace of the Sun. The Great Hall was adorned with Dornish tapestries depicting scorpions and suns, woven in vibrant oranges and reds. Torches flickered along the walls, reflected in polished brass trays and plates. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Platters of spiced fish, bowls of pomegranate seeds, pitchers of chilled water infused with mint leaves. Musicians played lively tunes while acrobats performed feats of tumbling and balancing to amuse the guests. Jon wore a light doublet in a muted shade of gray, trimmed with subtle red thread, a nod to his Targaryen lineage without flaunting the dragon sigil. He sat to Trystane's left, a place of honor. The prince was dressed in flowing Dornish robes of deep orange, embroidered with gold suns, and wore the Martell copper circlet. On his other side sat Lord Ironwood, stoic and silent, though he occasionally murmured agreement when the discussion turned to trade routes. Across the table, Illyria conversed quietly with Ser Brian and a pair of Dornish ladies, discussing potential ways to sponsor orphanages in the war-torn regions of the realm. After the main courses were served, Trystane stood, raising a goblet of Dornish red wine. The hall quieted, though music still played softly in the background. My lords, ladies, and honored guests, he began, his voice carrying with the graceful confidence of youth tempered by hardship. We gather here not merely to feast, but to mark a turning point. Too long has Westeros been fractured by old resentments, by war, by fear. Tonight, let it be known that House Martell extends the hand of friendship and alliance to Jon Snow, a man who carries both Stark and Targaryen blood. We look to a future where the Seven Kingdoms do not bow, but rather stand together, each region preserving its honor and traditions, while contributing to the greater good of the realm. He turned to Jon, lifting his goblet. To Jon Snow, he declared, may this new alliance be a beacon of hope. Jon rose, feeling a slight flush at so many eyes upon him. He had never been a man of grand speeches, but he understood the moment's gravity. He raised his own cup of wine. To Prince Trystane Martell and to Dorne, he said, his voice steady, I promise to carry out my duty to the realm and to all those who have suffered. May we forge a peace so strong that the horrors of the past become but a distant memory. A ripple of applause washed through the hall, and guests clinked their cups. Musicians struck a livelier tune, and a measure of warmth spread through Jon's chest. It felt almost surreal, being toasted in Sunspear's great hall, forging alliances he could scarcely have dreamed of in his youth. Yet he could not forget the scale of the task that awaited. This was but one stepping stone, albeit a significant one. As the evening wore on, Jon found himself drifting from conversation to conversation. Lords and ladies approached him, some with genuine curiosity, others with thinly veiled agendas. He spoke with them all, mindful that each word mattered. He shared stories of the North, of the battle against the undead, of the fortitude of people who had stood against impossible odds. Many listened in rapt attention, for the threat from beyond the wall had been more rumor than reality to them. Now, with the long night ended, it seemed to hold an almost mythical weight. Toward the end of the feast, Jon excused himself to step onto a terrace. The revelry inside continued, but he needed fresh air. The night sky glittered above, and a breeze carried the scent of the sea and orange blossoms from the palace gardens. Ghost padded up beside him. No matter how well-trained, the direwolf did not seem fond of crowded halls. Jon stroked Ghost's head absently as he looked out at the starlit desert and the distant shimmer of moonlight on water. He heard footsteps and glanced back to see Trystane approaching, a goblet in hand. The prince joined Jon at the railing, gazing out at the same vista. After a moment of companionable silence, Trystane spoke. "This alliance, what do you truly hope to achieve?" The prince asked, his tone free of the performative weight of earlier. He sounded genuinely curious, almost vulnerable. Jon exhaled. "I want to see an end to the hunger, the raids, the vendettas. We can't bring back the dead, but we can honor them by ensuring there's a future worth living for." He paused, looking at Trystane. "For me, it's not about sitting on the Iron Throne. We might not even need a throne at all if we have a functional council, a realm that works together." Trystane nodded slowly, swirling the wine in his goblet. "You remind me of Myrcella," he murmured, surprising Jon. She was gentle, thoughtful. She believed in peace. She believed that differences in birth or background could be bridged if people simply listened to one another. I often wonder what she would think of this new world, had she lived. A pang of sadness flickered in Jon. So many lost, with so much potential unfulfilled. We can only honor their memory by doing what they would have wanted. Myrcella, your father, your uncle, none of them wanted to see the realm torn apart. For a moment, they stood there, two young men burdened with the legacies of their families. Both Targaryen and Martell had inflicted and endured tragedies. Now, by some twist of fate, these two carried the hopes of their houses. Trystane drank the last of his wine and set the goblet on the railing. "In that we are agreed. Rest tonight, Jon Snow. Tomorrow we can begin discussing next steps. There is much to do." In the days that followed, messengers bearing the alliance's terms fanned out across Westeros. Ravens flew with sealed letters, proclaiming the new partnership between House Targaryen, via Jon Snow, and House Martell. While some lords in the Crownlands, Stormlands, and Reach welcomed the news, others viewed it with suspicion or outright hostility. The memory of Daenerys' final days and the Targaryen name's association with fire and blood still festered in many minds. Yet as harvest time approached in the southernmost regions, caravans guarded by Dornish soldiers began ferrying surplus grain and supplies northwards, halting in every war-torn village along the way. They brought relief to communities teetering on the edge of starvation. In return, representatives from several houses, Tyrell remnants, Tarly knights, and even a few former Baratheon bannermen traveled south to coordinate and repay the aid with skilled labor for irrigation projects or promises of future trade concessions. Jon, for his part, didn't remain idle in Sunspear. He moved through the city's streets, meeting merchants and small folk. His presence stoked curiosity among the Dornish. The wolf dragon, some called him, half in jest, half in awe. He helped organize patrols to rid the region of brigands. He listened to the concerns of Dornish fisherfolk about pirates along the coast. Quietly, he used what resources he had to strengthen local governance. Dorne's stability would set an example, proving that cooperation with this new Targaryen-Stark alliance yielded tangible benefits. Yet unity was a fragile thing. Word arrived of skirmishes near the Blackwater Rush, where unscrupulous mercenaries raided villages. Whispers of Lannister remnants hoarding gold in the Westerlands circulated. There were even rumors that in the north, some lords grumbled about bending to a Targaryen name again, uncertain of Jon's loyalty to the Stark blood. Day by day, new challenges arose, each threatening to undo the tenuous progress. Illyria noticed the toll this took on Jon. One afternoon, she found him at the palace stables, personally tending to Kestrel, his horse. The stable was cool and dim, filled with the scent of hay and leather. Jon's sleeves were rolled up as he brushed the mare's flank, his movements methodical, perhaps an effort to soothe his own restless mind. Illyria approached, standing at a respectful distance. "You work harder than any man I've met," she said. "It seems you hardly sleep, always reading reports or training patrols. You'll drive yourself mad at this pace." Jon let out a weary breath. "There's too much to do," he said without turning. "Every day I learn of another village that needs aid, another petty lord stirring trouble. Sometimes I wonder if it's too big a task for anyone." Illyria stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a bold gesture, but she was known for her boldness. "Perhaps no one can do it alone," she said gently. "That is why alliances matter. That is why you lean on us, on Dorne, on the northern lords who still trust you. Leadership doesn't mean carrying every burden yourself." He paused his brushing. "I know," he said quietly. "Yet if something fails, if people suffer because we didn't do enough, that blame is mine. I took this on. I can't stand by and let people starve or be murdered by outlaws." Illyria's dark eyes searched his face. "You're not the only one who wants to see this succeed. Let us share the burden." She hesitated, then added, "Dorne is with you. We are with you." Jon managed a half-smile, subdued but genuine. "Thank you," he said, setting down the brush. "Sometimes I forget I have allies in all this. I've spent so long fighting battles alone." He gently patted Kestrel's neck, then moved to exit the stall, Illyria by his side. Outside, the sun beat down on the courtyard, the sky a brilliant tapestry of blue and gold. A servant rushed over with a letter, sealed with wax. Jon took it, noting the sigil, a wolf's head of House Stark. Breaking the seal, he scanned the contents. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "What is it?" Illyria asked, her tone hushed. "It's from Sansa," Jon said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Trouble in the north. House Glover refuses to recognize any Targaryen claim, even mine. They're threatening to withhold grain shipments to the Crownlands, insisting on full northern independence." He frowned. "I should have anticipated this. They've never quite forgiven me for bending the knee to Daenerys, or for the turmoil at Winterfell." Illyria nodded, her brow furrowed. "Then perhaps you need to go to them directly. Remind them of your Stark side. Show them the new reality." Jon sighed. "Yes, that might be the only way. But leaving Dorne now with so much still in flux..." He trailed off, torn. Duty pulled him in every direction at once. Illyria touched his arm gently. "We'll handle things here. Dorne is committed. Prince Trystane is more confident in this alliance each day. If the North needs you, then go. Show them that you haven't turned your back on them." Jon nodded slowly. "I will. I just hope I can settle things quickly." He folded the letter and tucked it away. "Much rests on the North's acceptance. If the houses there remain divided, the whole realm feels it." With that, plans were set in motion for Jon to travel north. He would be accompanied by a small entourage, just enough to maintain safety without appearing threatening to his own people. The roads north were familiar in a way the Dornish sands were not. APS speaking face-to-face with Lord Glover and the other wary northern lords would dispel some of their fears. Or perhaps it would deepen the rift. Jon would face that challenge as he had faced all others, by meeting it head-on. His departure day arrived under a hazy dawn sky. Prince Trystane stood in the courtyard to see him off, along with a handful of Dornish nobles. Illyria was there too, quietly supportive. Jon clasped Trystane's forearm in a warrior's farewell. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said. "I'll return once the northern matters are resolved." Trystane nodded. "We will press on with the next phase here, organizing supply lines and stepping up patrols. Safe travels." Jon mounted Kestrel, Ghost loping beside him. As he rode out of Sunspear's gates, the city stretched before him, a quilt of pale rooftops and winding streets. The smell of the sea and the desert air lingered, a reminder of the alliance that had taken root here. In his saddlebags, he carried copies of the treaty bearing the Martell sun and spear sigil alongside a stylized wolf and dragon. He wondered how such a symbol would be received in the north. The journey took many weeks. The landscape shifted from desert to plains, from plains to rolling hills, and from there into the familiar woodlands of the riverlands. Jon could sense the scars of war everywhere. Half-rebuilt inns, scattered cottages with fresh graves in the yard, fields that still had not been sown. Yet in each village he found flickers of hope. Merchants mentioned that Dornish caravans had passed through, distributing supplies and forging trade ties. The results were tangible. A few extra barrels of grain, some salted fish from the southern coasts. That small improvement in daily life could mean the difference between famine and survival. As Jon's party pressed further north, the air grew colder. By the time they reached the neck, Mist draped the swamps and pine forests like a cloak. It felt both nostalgic and foreboding to Jon, who recalled crossing this region on his way south so many years ago under vastly different circumstances. Here, the local crannogmen eyed him with guarded curiosity. They were loyal to House Reed, who in turn had always stood by the Starks. Yet they had also heard the rumors of a Targaryen claim. Some whispered that the dragon's blood might overshadow the wolf's. Finally, they emerged onto the wide expanse leading to Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the entry to the north. Though it was in partial ruin, repairs had begun, scaffolding lining the half-collapsed towers. A handful of Stark guardsmen recognized Jon and greeted him with relief. They reported that Sansa had returned to Winterfell, working tirelessly to consolidate the North's scattered resources. Lord Glover, however, was holed up in Deepwood Motte, refusing to attend any council. Jon grimaced but pressed on. At Winterfell, banners with the direwolf sigil fluttered in the cold wind. The castle's walls bore signs of recent work, new stones filling in where battles had wreaked havoc. Smoke curled from the great chimneys, a comforting sight against the gray sky. As Jon rode through the gates, stable hands rushed forward to take their horses. Ghost drew startled glances, but few in Winterfell were strangers to direwolves anymore. Sansa met him in the courtyard, flanked by Brienne of Tarth and a few northern knights. The Lady of Winterfell looked regal in her dark blue furs, her hair pinned back in a simple but elegant style. A faint smile curved her lips as Jon dismounted. He embraced her, feeling a rush of warmth despite the chill. They had both lost so much, yet seeing her here, safe and strong, was a rare solace. "You made it," Sansa said, her voice colored by relief. "I feared you'd be delayed by the troubles along the way." Jon shook his head. "No major delays, though we saw signs of outlaws and burned farms. The realm isn't healing fast enough. But I come from Dorne with news. We've secured an alliance." Sansa's eyes widened slightly. "I received your raven, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. The Martells and Ilaria Sand actually pledged their support." Jon nodded. "They did. We have a chance, Sansa. But now we need the North to stand with us too. How are things here?" Her expression grew somber. "Better than at the height of the wars, but not good. Crops are meager, and many smaller lords squabble over land disputes. Glover is the most vocal in his distrust. He claims you've abandoned your roots." Jon's jaw tightened. "Then I'll speak with him directly. I owe him that much." They walked into the great hall, the warmth of the fires wrapping around them. The hall was not crowded, but there were enough people, lords, knights, counselors, gathered to create a hum of activity. Jon greeted each politely, noticing how some eyed him with open wariness, while others gave him respectful bows or nods. He took the seat at Sansa's side when they convened a short meeting of the Northern Council. One by one, lords reported on their holdings. Most were scraping by, replanting fields, rebuilding walls. The talk soon turned to external threats: bands of Ironborn raiders near the coast, rumors of Sellswords crossing the Neck, and, of course, the question of southern alliances. Some lords supported Sansa's stance of measured cooperation. Others were more resistant, citing northern independence. Over and over, the matter of House Glover arose. "We can't fully commit resources south if Lord Glover refuses to open Deepwood Motte's granaries," Lord Serwyn pointed out. "Our own people might starve if we don't share supplies internally." Jon listened, absorbing the tension. At last, he stood and addressed the room. "I will go to Deepwood Motte," he said firmly. "I'll meet with Lord Glover in person. We were allies once. He supported me against Ramsay Bolton. I need to remind him of why the North stood together, then and now." Sansa placed a hand on his forearm. "Be cautious," she murmured. "Glover is proud. He won't take kindly to demands." Jon nodded. "I know, but I won't be demanding anything. I'll ask for his trust and see if we can find common ground." That very afternoon, he set out with a small band of loyalists, including several Stark guards and Ghost. The journey to Deepwood Motte took them through thick pine forests and across rocky hills. The north was in the midst of its short summer, though the air still carried a crisp edge. Jon felt the weight of memories. Once he had marched under the direwolf banner against the Bolton men. Now his foes were not so clear-cut. They were lords who questioned his intentions, or simple peasants struggling to survive. Unity was a far trickier opponent than any single army. They arrived at Deepwood Motte to find the gates closed. Jon announced himself, requesting parley. After a tense wait, the drawbridge lowered. Lord Glover stood atop the wall, frowning down. He wore thick furs, and his face bore the lines of a man burdened by worry and resentment. At length he admitted Jon inside. In the great hall of Deepwood Motte, a sparse, cold chamber compared to Winterfell's, Lord Glover did not offer warm welcomes. He remained standing, arms crossed over his chest. "You have some nerve returning here," he said, voice tight. "We gave our support when you called the banners. Then you bent the knee to a dragon queen. We lost good men. Now you say you carry Targaryen blood? I wonder if the North truly matters to you." Jon met the older man's glare evenly. "You have every right to be angry," he said calmly. "I never wanted to bring the North into a war for the throne, but I had no choice once the dead marched on us. I did what I believed was necessary. And yes, I have Targaryen blood, but I was raised Stark. I fought for the North my entire life. I fight for it still." Lord Glover's expression didn't soften. "Fight for it how? By forging alliances in Dorne, with a house that's never cared for northern affairs." Jon took a steadying breath. "House Martell and others in the south can provide aid we desperately need. Food, resources, stability. The war devastated our land. We cannot stand entirely alone. Not if we want to rebuild and ensure a future free from constant fear." Glover's eyes narrowed. "And what do the Dornish want in return?" "To be part of a realm that works together," Jon replied. "A council of equals, not one dominated by a single throne. We've seen what tyranny does. We're trying something new." A bitter laugh escaped Glover's lips. "A council of equals. Sounds pretty words, but what guarantee do we have that this Targaryen alliance won't turn into another tyranny? The North has been betrayed time and again." Jon felt a flash of frustration, but he kept his voice level. "I can't give you absolute guarantees," he said. "No one can, but I can give you my word. And if that word means nothing to you, then we have no foundation left. Remember, I bled for the North, died for it even." He lifted his gaze, letting the weight of his resurrection and sacrifices linger in the air. "I ask only that you stand with me now, as we stood together against the Boltons. The North still needs its unity. If we fracture over old grudges, we lose everything we fought for." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees. Lord Glover looked away, grappling with his pride, his fears, and his memories of men lost. He knew Jon was not a typical Southern king. He knew Jon had once spared House Glover from the Bolton yoke. Yet the bitterness festered. Finally, Glover exhaled heavily. "I can spare some grain," he muttered, "but I won't bend the knee to a Targaryen queen or any Targaryen claim. If you want my continued support, don't force me to acknowledge a foreign rule." Jon gave a curt nod. "I'm not asking you to bend the knee to anyone but your conscience. If you'll stand with me in defending the North, and if you'll help feed those in need, that is enough for now." It was a fragile accord, but it was something. Over the next day, Jon stayed at Deepwood Motte, meeting with local stewards to arrange for shipments of grain to Winterfell and potentially beyond if the harvests permitted. He spoke with Glover's soldiers, who remembered the old battles against the Boltons. Slowly, the tension thawed, though it never fully dissipated. Lord Glover might not trust the Targaryen side of Jon, but he respected the Stark side enough to keep the peace, at least for the moment. When Jon returned to Winterfell with the news, Sansa greeted him with a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "It's a start," she said, "and sometimes that's the best we can hope for. Now, we must send word to the other northern lords. Let them see that Glover isn't openly defying us. That will strengthen our hand." Jon agreed, though he remained wary. This tension in the north mirrored the tension across Westeros. Everything was precarious, balanced on a knife's edge of mutual suspicion and fragile hopes. The alliance with Dorne, the uncertain acceptance in the north, the scattered help from other regions, all could unravel if mismanaged. He thought of the unwavering loyalty of the Night's Watch, the sense of brotherhood that had bound men of all backgrounds together against a common threat. Such unity was possible if people believed in something greater than their pride. Thus began the new phase of Jon's mission, bridging the gap between South and North, between Targaryen and Stark, between old hatreds and new possibilities. Ravens flew from Winterfell to Sunspear, carrying updates on progress. Dornish merchants arrived in White Harbor with ships full of citrus, spices, and even glass, forging new economic ties. In response, northern blacksmiths and trappers sent furs and crafted goods south, establishing a fledgling network of trade that benefited both sides. A shift was palpable, small, but undeniable. Still, Jon knew the biggest challenges lay ahead. The Lannister holdouts in the Westerlands, the Iron Islands' new unpredictability, the fractured Stormlands with no clear leadership since the Baratheon line had nearly died out. Even the Vale Lords, though loyal to House Arryn, kept their own counsel. He would need to navigate all of this, building upon the fragile trust he had earned so far. And overshadowing it all was the question: would the realm accept a leader who refused to call himself king, yet carried the blood of dragons? One windy afternoon, as Jon stood on Winterfell's battlements, looking over the courtyard where recruits drilled and small folk bustled about, Sansa joined him. She pulled her fur cloak tighter against the chill. For a moment, they simply watched the day's life unfold below. Sparring swords, wagon wheels creaking, the scent of hot bread wafting from the kitchens. Sansa's voice was soft, introspective. Father wanted a peaceful realm. He wanted justice and honor. I used to think those were simple, naive dreams. But now, seeing you try to mend the kingdom, it makes me believe there's a chance. Jon glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. We had to endure a lot to reach this point, he said. But maybe that's what it takes to make lasting change. We've seen the horrors, so we know what we must never allow again. She placed a hand on his arm, and for a moment, they were just two siblings at the edge of the world, leaning on each other's strength. I'm proud of you, Jon, Sansa whispered. I truly am. He looked back over the walls at the horizon. In the distance, the forest stretched endless, like the future. Unmapped, dangerous, yet full of untapped potential. We have to be proud of all of us, he said softly, because we'll need everyone, every house, every region to make this work. He paused, feeling a surge of determination. House Martell and House Targaryen might have started the spark, but we need the entire realm to feed the flame. Sansa nodded, and the breeze carried the scent of pine. In that moment, Winterfell felt both safe and precarious, a fortress built on centuries of tradition but open to the winds of change. Beyond its walls, a battered realm awaited healing. Jon Snow, half-wolf, half-dragon, would strive to unite them. And if the realm found enough grace to accept that union, perhaps, at long last, Westeros could emerge from the shadow of war into a new dawn of unity and peace. Some days later, Jon Snow found himself pacing the halls of Winterfell at an hour when most souls slept. A single torch flickered in an iron sconce, sending shadows crawling over the stone walls. Beneath the faint crackle of flame, Jon could hear the wind whispering through the battlements, a distant, mournful sound. He paused at a narrow window slit and peered out into the courtyard. Snow had not yet returned to the north, but a light frost clung to the ground, reminding him that no matter how many alliances or treaties he forged, the north would remain cold and unyielding in its truths. In the courtyard below, two guards kept watch by the main gate. Their cloaks were wrapped tightly, their breath fogging in the chill. Ghost prowled near them, his white fur almost luminous in the moonlight, an ever-watchful sentinel. Jon watched the great direwolf for a moment. Whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm him, Ghost's presence seemed to ground him, reminding him of who he was and why he persisted. His footsteps echoed on the stone as he resumed his pacing. Sleep felt impossible. His mind teemed with the challenges that faced him. Glover's grudging acceptance, the uneasy alliances forming in the south, the scars that still marred every corner of Westeros. Dorne was stable, for now sending grains and goods. Even so, rumors reached him of raiders in the Westerlands, ex-bandits turned mercenaries. Then there was the situation in the Stormlands. No clear head of House Baratheon, only scattered knights and lesser lords who bickered among themselves over who should rule. Jon's thoughts drifted to Gendry Waters, or Gendry Baratheon, as some called him after the late Queen Daenerys had once legitimized him in King's Landing. He had heard little of Gendry in recent moons. Some whispered that the black-haired smith had returned to the Stormlands, hoping to unite them under his father's banner. Others claimed he'd simply gone back to the forge somewhere near King's Landing. Jon hoped to confirm the truth soon. If Gendry had found a place among the Stormlander lords, that might solve one fragment of the realm's fractured puzzle. Eventually, Jon ended his restless walk by returning to his chambers. Dawn would not be long in coming, and he had promised Sansa he'd join her for a council session at daybreak. He banked the small fire in his hearth, let Ghost in from the courtyard, and lay down on the straw mattress. Weariness tugged at him. In that twilight space between wakefulness and sleep, he prayed, though he wasn't sure to whom, for the strength to keep going. Morning came in a bloom of gray light creeping through the shutters. Jon rose, dressed in his customary practical garb. Dark breeches, a leather jerkin bearing the Stark sigil tooled on one shoulder, and a cloak lined with coarse fur against the biting air. After breaking his fast in the great hall on bread, cheese, and hot tea, he headed to the council chamber. Sansa was already there, speaking in low tones with Lady Brienne and Maester Wolkan. A brazier burned in one corner, struggling to chase away the chill that permeated these ancient walls. The room smelled of parchment and candle wax. At Sansa's gesture, Jon took the seat to her right, while Brienne stood behind, watchful as ever. Around the table gathered several northern lords. Lord Serwyn, who looked anxious but determined. Lady Alis Karstark, newly returned from patrolling her war-torn lands, and a cluster of stewards and captains loyal to House Stark. Each carried a measure of concern etched across their features. Yet they also carried a spark of hope, one that had been absent in the darkest days of the wars. Sansa cleared her throat, and the low chatter subsided. "We received word this morning," she began, lifting a small scroll. "From White Harbor, Lord Manderly sends greetings. He's managed to restore part of the harbor, which is good news. However, he reports a growing concern over ships sailing from the southeast, some under questionable flags. Their captains refuse to declare allegiance or purpose. They trade little but scout often." Jon's brow furrowed. The sea route to White Harbor was crucial. He remembered the times when White Harbor had been the North's lifeline to the rest of Westeros. "Any sign they're pirates? Or Ironborn?" he asked. Sansa handed the scroll to him. "Lord Manderly suspects they could be independent cell sails, perhaps picking at the edges of a weakened realm. He asks us to send additional patrols, or at least stand ready should they land." Jon read quickly, scanning for details. "We can't spare too many men," he said, glancing at the northern lords. "House Mormont is still rebuilding Bear Island. House Glover is, well, barely cooperative. Lady Alis, could you muster riders from Carhold to check the land routes near White Harbor?" Alis Karstark, a young woman with a quiet strength about her, nodded. "I can spare a few men, enough to keep watch along the roads. But if they land in force, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Sansa interjected gently, but her voice wavered with concern. "We should send a raven to House Manderly, letting them know we support them and will do what we can." The council agreed. Maester Wolkan carefully noted their decision and prepared to draft the reply. Jon leaned back in his chair. One more threat, one more PR. Oblum to address and so few resources. The North was large and its population still recovering. Every step forward felt precarious. Next, Sansa glanced at Jon. "We've also had a response from the Vale. Lord Royce expresses willingness to coordinate shipments of or in timber. He also mentions a possibility that Lady Anya Waynwood might wed one of the younger Stark cousins, forging a tie between our families. Jon blinked, absorbing the news. The Vale had been quiet after the war, preferring to keep to its fortress-clad mountains. Any friendly movement from them was welcome. That could be beneficial, he said. Stability with the Vale might draw them more fully into rebuilding efforts. A faint smile touched Sansa's lips. Precisely my thought. If Lord Glover continues to drag his feet, the Vale might prove a more reliable partner for northern trade. With winter always looming, having access to their resources could be a lifeline. Jon nodded. Good. Let's formalize that, and let them know that we stand ready to assist if bandits appear in the mountains. Working together has to go both ways. Through the morning, they addressed a litany of concerns. Small folk requesting seeds and tools, bandits in the Wolfswood, the slow trickle of refugees returning from the riverlands. Every issue pointed to the same problem. The realm's old structures had crumbled. The Iron Throne had once enforced a semblance of order, often through fear or gold, but now that central authority lay in ruins. Jon's new vision was to build something better, a realm where cooperation replaced tyranny. Yet forging that structure was more challenging than any single battle he'd fought. When the council finally adjourned, the sun stood high, its pale light illuminating Winterfell's courtyard. Sansa lingered, dispatching messages and thanking each lord for his input. Jon headed to the courtyard, where the clang of steel drew his attention. He found a cluster of young recruits practicing with wooden swords under the watchful eye of an older master-at-arms. Ghost trotted beside him, eliciting wide-eyed stares from the newcomers. Nearby, he spotted Davos Seaworth standing with arms crossed. The Onion Knight, as ever, wore a worn expression of concern, though in it shone a faint glimmer of optimism. With so many others gone, dead or scattered, it was a comfort to see Davos's familiar face. Jon had invited him north after word reached that King's Landing was still in chaos. Davos, never one to put himself above the cause, had gladly come to assist. He had a way of cutting through complications with simple honesty, and Jon valued his counsel. They greeted each other with warm familiarity. "Any luck with that supply shipment from the Stormlands?" Jon asked. Davos shook his head slowly. "The ravens we sent to Storm's End haven't been answered. Not sure who's in charge there anymore. I've heard talk that a few lords are trying to hold the castle in the name of the dead King Stannis, but that's nonsense. Lord Beric Dondarrion once roamed the Stormlands with his band, but most say he perished in the Great War. As for Gendry, I can't say where he's gone. Might be forging steel or forging alliances, for all I know." Jon's brow creased. "We could use a friendly face in the Stormlands. That region always played a crucial role, bridging north, south, and east. If it stays in disarray, raiders will take advantage of the chaos." He paused, thinking, "Maybe I should send another messenger, someone they'd trust." Davos shrugged. "Trust is in short supply these days, but we can try. I'll draft a new letter, put your seal on it, and see if that stirs a response." They walked side by side, the clang of practiced swords and the occasional shout punctuating the crisp air. As they passed under a stone archway, Davos lowered his voice. "How fare things with Dorne? Any new word from Prince Trystane?" Jon nodded. "He sent a raven a fortnight ago. The alliance is holding. They're organizing caravans to bring more supplies north before the next harvest. Dorne's merchants already arrived at White Harbor with a small fleet. Spices, citrus, some raw materials. It's a start." Davos let out a low whistle. "No easy feat to wrangle that. Well done, lad. Another step in the right direction." Jon paused, facing Davos with a serious expression. "It's more than I could have hoped for at times, but it feels so fragile, Davos. One spark and everything could unravel. Some old grudge, some unscrupulous cell's word, or another lord who decides he won't stand for the Targaryen name. Half the realm still whispers about Daenerys, about how she burned King's Landing. They hear Targaryen and think of fire and blood." Davos sighed. placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Aye, there's truth in that. But you're not your father, and you're not Daenerys. You're forging a path that's never been walked before. Of course, it's difficult. Yet every day you keep trying is a day we're not fighting. That alone is a miracle in Westeros." Jon offered a thin smile. "Thank you," he said softly. They parted ways, Davos heading to write the letters, Jon to oversee other tasks. But the Onion Knight's words clung to Jon's thoughts. He was indeed walking a precarious path, one that might topple at any moment, but it was better than bathing the realm in more blood. If a miracle was needed, so be it. They'd attempt it all the same. Late that afternoon, Jon decided to take a ride beyond Winterfell's walls. He gathered a few trusted companions, Ed Tollett among them, who had followed him north again after briefly aiding with the southern caravans. Ed wore a perpetually mournful look, but Jon knew him to be steadfast. They rode a short distance into the surrounding woods, accompanied by a handful of Stark guards. Ghost led the way, weaving through the underbrush with silent grace. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but frost coated the ground. The sun cast long shadows among the pines, illuminating dust motes that danced in the pale light. Jon guided Kestrel, his brown courser, through the winding trail. The cold air stung his cheeks, but he welcomed it. There was something cleansing about the North's chill. He brought the small group to a clearing where the remains of a watchtower stood. Its stones, blackened by fire, gave mute testimony to the battles fought in the war against the Boltons. Now, grass grew in the charred cracks, and a few hardy wildflowers peeked out. Jon dismounted, letting Kestrel graze. Ed and the others followed suit, scanning the area. Ghost sniffed around the remnants of the tower, as though searching for ghosts of battles past. Jon ran his hand over the stone, the rough surface crumbling slightly under his touch. A memory surfaced of the desperation he'd once felt, rallying every last ally against Ramsay Bolton, all for Winterfell. Then, too, the realm had felt on the brink of ruin. Yet they had persevered. Now he faced a challenge of a different sort, but no less daunting. Ed wandered closer, kicking a loose rock with his boot. "Doesn't look like much, does it?" Jon half smiled. "No, but it was once a strong point in the line of defense for Winterfell. Now it's rubble." Ed nodded, gaze drifting over the bleak remains. "All over the realm we have spots like this, burned out, broken. Each place with a story of some tragedy." He sighed, crossing his arms. "It's a wonder people don't just give up." Jon understood the sentiment. "They don't give up because they have nowhere else to go," he said quietly. "And because, deep down, people want to live. We owe it to them to keep trying." They lingered in the clearing, letting the horses rest. Then, after a time, Jon remounted and led them back toward Winterfell, the pine needles crunching under the horses' hooves. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a moment of rare peace, and Jon allowed himself to drink it in, knowing that peace was fleeting in Westeros. That evening, as darkness settled and the hearths in Winterfell blazed, Jon prepared letters to send south. One was addressed to Prince Trystane Martell, updating him on northern developments and requesting more news about trade caravans. Another was to the Tyrell loyalists in the Reach. Though House Tyrell was practically extinct after the wars, a handful of lesser branches and sworn bannermen remained, trying to rebuild Highgarden and its surrounding lands. Their farmland was famously fertile, and if they joined the new alliance, the realm's food supply would be far less precarious. A third letter he composed to Yara Greyjoy, who had reclaimed some portion of the Iron Islands after the war. Jon wasn't certain Yara would respond favorably. She was fierce and independent, but if she could be convinced to curb Ironborn raiding and possibly support maritime trade routes, that could be invaluable. He wrote well into the night, the scratch of the quill on parchment accompanying the soft crackle of the fire. Maester Wolken offered him a cup of mulled wine to keep him warm, and Jon accepted gratefully, though the taste was more bitter than he remembered. By the time he sealed the final letter with wax bearing the wolf and dragon sigil, weariness tugged at his every muscle. But a sense of accomplishment, however small, buoyed him. Every missive, every entreaty, was a thread in the tapestry he hoped to weave. A unified Westeros, or at least a Westeros not so bent on tearing itself apart. Soon after, he collapsed into bed, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning dawned, a crisp hush over the castle. Jon took breakfast quickly, then headed to the maester's tower to see his letters off. The roost at the top of the tower bustled with ravens, each perched in neat rows. The birds croaked and rustled their feathers as Wolkan carefully tied messages to their legs. One by one, the ravens flew into the pale sky, each bearing a small piece of Jon's hope. He watched them vanish over the walls until their dark shapes melted into the horizon. Then he turned away, descending the winding steps. He encountered Sansa in the corridor, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. "I'm heading to the training yard," she said. "Lady Brienne is giving some instructions to the younger knights. I thought I might observe. Would you join us?" Jon hesitated. Duties pressed at him from every side, but a moment of respite of normalcy might help. I'll come," he said. Together, they walked to the yard, where Brienne of Tarth oversaw a handful of knights and squires. The clang of steel on steel echoed in the crisp air. Brienne's clear voice carried as she corrected their stances and footwork. The knights, some fresh from smaller houses in the north, listened respectfully. They knew her reputation as a formidable warrior. Sansa and Jon leaned against a wooden fence that partitioned the yard, watching. Sansa's expression held a touch of admiration. "Brienne has come such a long way," she said softly. "And these young knights, some are the sons of lords who once fought against us." Jon nodded. "That's the future we're trying to shape, isn't it? Enemies turned allies, so we don't keep repeating the same battles." Sansa looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you think it's possible, truly, that we can teach the next generation to put aside the old hatreds?" Jon exhaled slowly. "It has to be. If not, we'll end up with a repeat of the War of the Five Kings or worse. I have to believe we can do better." Sansa fell silent for a moment, then smiled gently. "You're a stubborn man, Jon Snow, but I suppose that's what we need now." As they spoke, 2 horses rode into the yard, their riders bundled against the cold. Jon recognized one as a Stark guard, the other as a courier from the Riverlands, if the mud-stained cloak and tired horse were any indication. The courier dismounted and headed straight for them, fumbling with a scroll case at his belt. Lord Snow," the courier panted, bowing. "I come from Lord Edmure Tully in Riverrun. Urgent news." Jon felt a tightening in his chest. He glanced at Sansa, then took the scroll and broke the seal. Scanning its contents, he read quickly, "Trouble in the Riverlands." A band of mercenaries led by remnants of the Lannister army were raiding farmsteads, extorting peasants. Edmure Tully lacked the resources to deal with them thoroughly. Most of his men were still rebuilding the region's bridges and dikes. He requested aid, citing the newly forming alliance as reason enough to share responsibilities. Jon read it again, lips pressed into a firm line. Then he handed the message to Sansa. Her eyes flicked over the words, and she let out a soft breath. "I feared as much," she murmured. "We all knew some Lannister loyalists might cause havoc. Many were never accounted for after the war." Jon dismissed the courier with instructions to rest and eat, then turned to Sansa, Brienne, and Ed, who had approached upon seeing the courier's urgency. "We have to help," he said simply. "The Riverlands are vital to the realm's trade. If they're overrun by mercenaries, no one can safely move goods. And Lord Tully was always a friend to House Stark." Ed frowned. "Can we spare men? The North's not exactly brimming with extra swords." Jon's gaze settled on Brienne. "If we don't intervene, we risk more chaos." Edmure was right to ask. This is exactly what a united realm should do. It's not just about treaties on parchment. It's about standing together. Brienne bowed her head in acknowledgement. "If you wish, my lord, I can lead a small force south. I know the Riverlands well enough. We can coordinate with Tully's men." Jon considered the idea. Brienne was one of the most capable warriors he knew, and her honor was unimpeachable. Yet sending her meant losing a key defender in Winterfell. "We'll need to gather volunteers," he said. "Men who can be spared, perhaps 200 at most. Enough to reinforce Riverrun. Help them push back these brigands." Sansa nodded. "We can send ravens to smaller northern houses that have somewhat recovered. See if they'll contribute men. House Ryswell, House Mormont, though I doubt House Mormont can send many. We'll piece together a force." Jon gave a grim smile. "We might also ask Dorne if they can spare any riders, though it's a long journey for them." Ed's mouth twitched. "Dornishmen in the Riverlands? We'll start a rumor that you're assembling an army to conquer everything in between." Jon grimaced but said, "Let the realm talk. If we stand by while the Riverlands bleed, we send the wrong message." They finalized plans that afternoon. Brienne would lead the company, with Ed Tollett at her side, a symbol of both southern and northern cooperation. If any Dornish troops were willing to ride north to help, so much the better. Sansa quickly dictated letters, referencing the alliance's obligations to protect each region in crisis. Jon penned a personal note to Edmure Tully, promising him aid. Within 2 days, a small force of some 100 men had gathered in Winterfell's courtyard, a mix of knights, free riders, and older veterans who had seen too many wars but still believed in Jon's cause. They prepared to march south. Provisions packed, horses saddled, weapons inspected. Brienne stood at their head, clad in her distinctive armor, cloak billowing in the cold wind. Ed donned a worn cloak bearing the Stark sigil, quietly resigning himself to more travel. Jon addressed them before they set out. "You go not to conquer," he told the assembled men, "but to protect. The Riverlands have suffered enough. Show them that we stand together, that we can be better than the lords who tore the realm apart for their own ambitions. Fight with honor and return safely." The men nodded, determination in their expressions. Ghost watched from the side, silent as snowfall. Brienne saluted Jon, then turned her horse, leading the group out of Winterfell's gates. Their departure felt like watching a piece of the tenuous New Order slip away. Jon prayed they would find victory, or at least drive the brigands into retreat without too much bloodshed. The next weeks passed in an uneasy lull at Winterfell. Sansa and Jon continued to oversee daily governance, dealing with local disputes, rationing supplies, coordinating with the smaller holds. Ravens came and went, carrying fragments of news from across Westeros. Occasionally, they received updates from Brienne's expedition. Slow progress, a few skirmishes in the Riverlands, some success in liberating villages. Lord Tully's men fought alongside them with resolve, grateful for the northern support. Then, one cold morning, as Jon was returning from a patrol of nearby farmland, a rider galloped into the courtyard. He bore the sigil of House Tully but wore no cloak. His eyes were wild with urgency. Jon barely had time to dismount before the man tumbled from his horse, breathless. "My lord," the messenger gasped. "Ser Brienne, a battle at the crossing by Fairmarket. The mercenaries had more men than we realized. They've set up a fortification. Ser Brienne requests reinforcements or at least a strategy. They're pinned down." Jon set his jaw. Fairmarket was a key crossing on the Blue Fork of the Trident. If Brienne and Ed were bogged down there, the mercenaries might push them back or entrap them in a siege. "How many men are we talking about?" Jon asked quietly. "Hard to say, M-Lord," the messenger wheezed. "They've recruited local outlaws plus Lannister stragglers, maybe 300, and they have a pair of scorpions. Siege weapons on a hill controlling the approach." Jon nodded grimly. "I'll see what can be done." He turned to a nearby guard. "Fetch Lady Sansa, Davos, and the captains at once." He directed the messenger to rest and eat, then paced, his mind racing. Brienne's force was outnumbered, but they had discipline on their side. If they were forced to assault entrenched positions, they'd suffer heavy casualties. Another pitched battle was the last thing Jon wanted. But ignoring the situation meant letting the Riverlands descend into deeper chaos, undermining everything they'd worked for. Soon, Sansa and Davos arrived, along with a few northern captains. Jon quickly relayed the news. Sansa's face paled, and Davos cursed under his breath. The captains looked at each other with somber eyes, knowing what was being asked of them. Sansa spoke first. "We have maybe 50 more men that can be spared here, plus some archers. But would it be enough?" Jon frowned. 50 might not turn the tide of a siege. We need a strategy. Or we need more men from somewhere else. Davos shook his head. "Not many somewhere else's to rely on, lad. Unless your southern allies can send troops in time. Like the Dornish." Jon rubbed his temples. "Even if we send a raven now, it's unlikely they can gather, march, and arrive at the riverlands quickly enough. The crossing could be lost by then." Sansa folded her arms. "Could we approach the Vale? Lord Royce has men. If they join us in the riverlands, that would reinforce the front." Jon considered that. It might work. The Vale is closer, and some of their forces might already be near the Bloody Gate. But we'd need to coordinate quickly. They crafted a plan. Jon would lead the 50 additional men south, aiming to bolster Brienne's force directly. Meanwhile, Sansa would dispatch urgent ravens to Lord Royce, requesting immediate assistance at Fairmarket. It was a gamble. If the Vale refused or delayed, Jon's reinforcement might be too small to matter. But if everything aligned, they could trap the mercenaries in a pincer. Davos volunteered to ride with Jon, citing his experience as a strategist. Sansa would remain in Winterfell to maintain order and keep the northern lords calm. That evening, they gathered what supplies they could spare. Armor, spears, arrows, provisions. The soldiers, many of them older veterans, quietly readied themselves, aware of the dangers ahead. Ghost whined at Jon's side, seemingly sensing the tension. Before dawn, Jon and his small relief force set out from Winterfell, the sky still painted by stars. The chill of night clung to their cloaks, and frost crackled under their horses' hooves. Jon rode at the head, Davos just behind him, and Ghost pacing in the gloom. They carried a simple banner, the direwolf of House Stark merged with a faint outline of a dragon above it. A subtle reminder that this was a new age of alliances. The journey south felt both familiar and grim. They retraced routes scarred by past battles, passing villages where people recognized the Stark banner and rushed out to wave or ask for news. Jon explained they were on their way to aid the riverlands. Though the villagers had little to spare, some insisted on providing what meager supplies they could. A basket of dried mushrooms, an old wineskin, blankets sewn from rough wool. Each gesture of support weighed on Jon's heart. These people had so little left, yet they gave willingly, desperate to help the realm piece itself back together. At Moat Cailin, they slowed only long enough to rest the horses and gather any stray soldiers who might volunteer. A handful joined, men hardened by years of conflict. Then they pressed on, riding through the next boggy terrain, across the causeway. Rain set in, turning the roads to muck. The men grumbled, but Jon pushed them forward, mindful of Brienne and Ed pinned at Fairmarket. Each day lost was another day the mercenaries could fortify or commit atrocities against the local populace. They reached the riverlands under a sky of rolling gray clouds. The once lush fields showed signs of recovery. Scattered harvests, new growth. Yet pockets of destruction remained, especially near the roads. When they passed an abandoned hamlet, Davos shook his head sadly. These people never catch a break. First the War of the Five Kings, then the war against the dead, then the Dragon Queen's push south. Now brigands again. No wonder they're wary of any banner that rides by. Jon nodded, his face set. We must break this cycle somehow. On the 5th day of their march, they finally neared Fairmarket. Smoke rose in the distance, and they heard the faint thunder of hooves. Ghost's ears pricked up. Jon signaled for his men to slow. They advanced cautiously, forging a path through the rolling terrain. A wide plain stretched ahead, broken by gentle hills and the serpentine line of the Blue Fork. Fairmarket itself lay on the far side of a stone bridge, once a bustling trading point. Now, tents and barricades ringed the area, along with the fluttering banners of Tully and Stark. Within those lines, Jon glimpsed the battered encampments of Brienne's forces. He ordered a scout forward, a quiet man named Willis, to check the lay of the land. Willis crept off, returning half an hour later with an urgent report. The mercenaries, numbering close to 300, were entrenched on a low hill near the crossing, protected by sharpened stakes and at least 2 scorpions. They'd apparently raided local hamlets for food and conscripted forced labor. Brienne's contingent was outnumbered and pinned down by constant arrow fire. Morale was shaken. The men worried the mercenaries might attempt a night attack. Jon exchanged a grim look with Davos. They couldn't simply charge a fortified position. They needed to link up with Brienne's camp without getting cut down by the scorpions. "We'll skirt around to the west," he decided. "We have to reach her lines first." Leading his men carefully around a patch of dense woodland, Jon approached the Tully Stark encampment from the rear. Nervous sentries challenged them, arrows knocked. But once they recognized the banner, relief spread through the ranks. Brienne herself emerged, her face drawn but resolute beneath her helmet. Ed followed, looking grimmer than ever. They exchanged quick greetings. Brienne's usually reserved expression lit with relief. "We feared you might not come," she said plainly. "They're well dug in on that hill. We've lost a dozen men trying to probe their defenses. We'd need 4 times our number to break them in a direct assault." Jon frowned. "And the Vale? We sent ravens? Any word?" Ed shook his head. "No sign of them yet. Could be they're on the way. Could be they're not coming. We can't say." Jon glanced at Davos. "Then we must hold until or unless the Vale arrives. If we can't dislodge them by force, maybe we can harass their supply lines, cut them off from the farmland. Starve them out or force them to come to us." Brienne nodded slowly. "They have some farmland to the south near an old mill. We suspect they've stored stolen grain there. A raiding party might deny them those supplies." Jon agreed. It was a classic tactic. If you couldn't outnumber the enemy, you could at least deny them sustenance. "We'll do it tonight. Under cover of darkness. We'll send a team to burn their stores." Ed offered a bleak grin. "Aye, that's something we Night's Watchmen know how to do. Raid under the moon." Plans were made swiftly. That night, once the sky turned ink black and the mercenaries' campfires dotted the distant hill like fallen stars, Jon and a select group of volunteers crept along the riverbank, aiming for the southern farmland. The air was cold, and the ground slick from recent rain. Each step felt precarious. Ghosts slunk ahead, scouting for sentries. The men carried torches wrapped in cloth to hide their light. They found the old mill unguarded. Likely the mercenaries were confident no one would venture that far south. Inside, barrels and sacks of grain sat piled against the walls. Jon set his jaw, thinking of how that grain might feed the rightful owners of these lands. But necessity dictated denying it to the mercenaries first. At his signal, they spread lamp oil, tore open sacks, and prepared to torch the mill. Before doing so, Jon gestured for 2 men to take a small portion of the grain, if they could. No sense in letting it all go to waste if they could salvage some for the local peasants. Moments later, flames leaped high into the darkness, consuming the mill's timbers and devouring the stolen grain. The heat pressed against them, and the smell of smoke choked the air. Jon and his raiders retreated quickly, hearing distant shouts from the mercenary hill. Their sabotage was discovered. They had to vanish before the enemy's outriders arrived. They raced back toward Brienne's encampment, managing to evade the patrols now fanning out. By the time they slid through the sentry line, dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky with a sullen red glow. The sabotage was successful, but the mercenaries would be furious. The question was whether that fury would drive them to make mistakes or fuel a brutal counterattack. Indeed, by midday, the mercenaries launched a probing assault on Brienne's lines, presumably testing for weaknesses. Scores of ragged men poured downhill, some wearing remnants of Lannister armor, others dressed in simple leathers. They shouted curses, brandishing swords and axes. Brienne's archers rained arrows upon them, while Jon's men held the defensive stakes they'd erected. Davos stood near Jon, rallying the men with steady words. Ed led a flank of spear-wielders, dissuading any attempt to circle behind. The clash was fierce but relatively short. Faced with stiff resistance and accurate arrow fire, the mercenaries retreated, leaving behind half a dozen dead or wounded. Jon surveyed the field from a slight rise, breathing heavily. His men had held firm, but this was only a fraction of the enemy's force. If the mercenaries decided on a full assault, the defenders might be overrun. As he wiped sweat from his brow, a distant horn blast echoed over the plain. Heads turned, scanning the horizon. Another horn sounded, 3 deep notes that carried across the battlefield. Jon felt a surge of adrenaline, uncertain if it signaled friend or foe. Then, out of the western treeline, he saw movement, organized ranks of soldiers advancing in good order. The sunlight caught glimmers of steel. Banners fluttered above them. Familiar, azure banners with a falcon and moon. The Vale. Brienne turned to Jon with an astonished smile. "They came," she said softly. Sure enough, at the head of the column rode Lord Royce, clad in thick plate, the sigil of House Royce emblazoned on his surcoat. Beside him were knights from houses Corbray, Belmore, and Waynwood, forming a surprisingly sizable force of perhaps 200 mounted men. They thundered onto the field, forming a line opposite the mercenaries. Seeing themselves outflanked, the mercenaries hesitated. Jon wasted no time. He signaled Brienne to press forward from one side while the Vale Knights circled to the other, cutting off escape. The mercenaries, caught in a pincer, scrambled to retreat to their hill fortifications. The Vale cavalry thundered after them, lances lowered. Panic rippled through the mercenary ranks. When they tried to regroup behind their sharpened stakes and scorpions, Brienne led an infantry charge from the flank. Jon and Ed joined the fray, swords drawn, forcing the mercenaries to divide their attention. Chaos engulfed the hillside. Shouts, screams, the clang of steel. Archers loosed arrows from both sides. One of the mercenary scorpions fired a bolt that whistled past Jon's shoulder, burying itself in the earth. Ghost sprang at a man wielding a spear, teeth flashing. Davos shouted commands, urging men to stay in formation. Brienne's sword cleaved through an enemy's shield. Ed's group pinned down a cluster of outlaws near a rocky outcrop, while the Vale Knights systematically dismantled the main line of defense. The Scorpions proved troublesome, but the Vale archers concentrated fire on the crews manning them, forcing them to abandon the war machines. With that threat neutralized, the Allied forces advanced. Step by step, the mercenaries fell back, their lines crumbling. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered, while the more desperate fought to the last. By mid-afternoon, the hillside was littered with the dead and the dying. Smoke curled from a few burning tents. The battered remnants of the mercenary band either lay captured or had fled into the surrounding woods. Exhausted, Jon wiped blood and sweat from his brow, glancing around to take stock. The cost had been high. Some of Brienne's men lay motionless on the ground, and a handful of Vale Knights had fallen. Yet the mercenary threat at Fairmarket was broken. The crossing was secure, and the region might finally see respite from these raids. Lord Royce approached, his visor lifted, face streaked with dirt. He bowed stiffly to Jon, though his gaze flicked over him with reserved respect. "We came as soon as we could," Royce said. "Your raven reached me in time. The Vale does not forget the debt we owe House Stark for its years of friendship." Jon clasped the man's forearm. "You arrived at the perfect moment. Thank you. The Riverlands owe you as well." Royce nodded. "We'll remain a few days to help secure the area. Then we must return to the Vale. We have bandits of our own to deal with." Brienne joined them, removing her helmet and letting out a long breath. A fresh cut marred her cheek, but she paid it no mind. "We should see to the wounded," she said. "And these prisoners." Jon surveyed the cluster of mercenaries who had surrendered. Some clutched bleeding limbs or stared at the ground in defeat. "We'll give the wounded medical aid," Jon said. "Then those who can stand trial will face Lord Tully's judgment for raiding his lands. The rest, bury them with as much dignity as we can. No more pointless cruelty." Davos, limping slightly from a minor leg wound, approached. "Aye, that's the right of it. Let's see if the prisoners have any intelligence about other bands out there." So began the slow process of cleaning up the battlefield, gathering the wounded, burning the dead, sorting the meager spoils. By nightfall, the Allied forces had established a makeshift triage near the river, where maesters and field medics tended the injured. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy in the air. Jon moved among the tents, checking on his men, offering what comfort he could. Ghost padded behind him, silent, a ghostly sentinel against the flickering torchlight. He found Ed near a cookfire, cradling a bandaged arm. "You all right?" Jon asked, kneeling beside him. Ed nodded, grimacing. "Just a scratch. I'll live. We lost some good men, though." Jon's gaze dropped. "Yes," he said softly. "We did. But we saved many more from these brigands. If we'd done nothing, the riverlands would be overrun." Ed looked up, meeting Jon's eyes. "Is this what we'll be doing for years to come? Chasing down raiders and mercenaries wherever they pop up?" Jon inhaled. The question stung. "For a time, perhaps," he said, "until a stable order is established." No one said forging peace would be easy. Ed shook his head slowly. "I'll be content to be done with fighting once and for all. But I know duty doesn't often give us what we want." Jon clasped his friend's good shoulder, then rose and moved on. Eventually, he entered another tent near the center of camp, where a brazier burned low. Brienne was there, speaking in hushed tones with a few of her knights. She turned as Jon entered, offering a tired smile. "We've accounted for all the men," she said. "We'll bury our dead near the old sept in Fairmarket." The local villagers offered help with the funeral rites. It seems they're relieved beyond words to see these mercenaries gone. Jon allowed himself a small sense of relief. They deserve peace. Hopefully they can start rebuilding. And we should coordinate with Lord Tully to keep the roads secure. Maybe a permanent garrison. Brienne nodded. "Agreed. I'll ride to Riverrun in a few days to finalize details with Lord Edmure. Will you come?" Jon considered. "I'd like to, but I should see these men home or at least ensure they have proper rest. Also, we have pressing matters in Winterfell. Sansa is alone in her leadership there." "Understood," Brienne said. "Perhaps you can spare Davos or Ed to accompany me." Jon rubbed his brow, exhaustion creeping in. "I'll speak with them tomorrow. Let's rest now." As Brienne stepped away to speak with another knight, a quiet figure approached from the tent's far corner. A worn man with graying hair, face scarred, dressed in old Lannister leathers. Jon tensed for a moment, but the man held up empty hands. "Don't mean any trouble," the man said, voice rough. "I surrendered. Name's Orland Hill. I fought for the Lannisters once, but that was years ago. These mercenaries, I didn't have a choice. Not after everything burned." Jon studied the man's eyes. Tired, haunted, but not hostile. "You're one of the prisoners. Why are you here?" "Ser Brienne allowed me to speak with you," Orland muttered, shifting. "Said I might have information you'd want. I've seen the shape of the realm these days, traveling with those brigands. There are more like them out there, lots more. Scattered companies of sellswords, ex-soldiers. They roam the Crownlands, the Westerlands, sometimes even the Reach. They're waiting to see if this new alliance fails." Jon felt a chill. This man's words confirmed his fears. And if they see it fail, they'll carve up the realm as they please? Aye. Some are loyal to the idea of a Lannister restoration. Some only want gold. But they're well armed. They took a lot of stockpiled weapons from the spoils of King's Landing after the sack. Orland grimaced. "I only joined them so I wouldn't starve. I've no love for banditry." Jon glanced at Brienne, who had come closer, listening. She folded her arms, her face unreadable. "If the Crownlands and the Westerlands are infested with similar groups," she said, "we'll never establish peace." Jon nodded. "We'll have to root them out, but not by fighting each group one by one. We need a broader strategy. Some show of unified force or a new system that persuades them there's nothing to gain from terrorizing the realm." Orland looked between them. "I can tell you where I know some groups are hiding," he offered haltingly. "It might earn me a lesser sentence?" Jon studied him. "You'll face judgment for your part in these raids." but cooperation can help your case." The man nodded, swallowing. "Thank you." It was a grim reminder that though they'd won a battle here, the war for stability raged on across the realm. Jon felt a pit in his stomach. He'd barely managed to keep the North from fracturing. He'd secured Dorne's aid. Now he stood in the riverlands, facing the reality that the old wounds of the Lannister wars still bled. That night, sleep came fitfully in a small traveling tent. Jon tried to rest, but images of more mercenaries, the crownlands in flames, and the looming threat of endless conflict intruded. At times, he dreamed of dragons again, swirling in a dark sky over King's Landing. He saw Daenerys's face, stern and sad, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. Waking in a cold sweat, he reminded himself that he wasn't alone, that this new alliance included good people who wanted peace. He prayed that would be enough. In the morning, after tending to the wounded and organizing the next steps, Jon decided to ride for Riverrun with a small escort. Brienne would come, and they would leave Davos and Ed to oversee the final mopping up at Fairmarket. Lord Royce and his Vale Knights planned to remain a few days as well, ensuring no second wave of attackers lurked in the area. The ride to Riverrun took them along the Red Fork, the river glinting under a pale sun. Farmers toiled in the fields, or what was left of them, and refugees trudged along the roads with handcarts, returning to homesteads they had fled. Some recognized the Stark banner and waved shyly. Others looked on with guarded hope. After so many betrayals, trust was earned slowly. They reached Riverrun by late afternoon. The great castle perched at the fork of the river, its walls rising proudly above the flowing waters. The drawbridge was lowered for them, and Tully guards welcomed them with modest ceremony. Inside, Edmure Tully himself met them in the courtyard, relief evident on his tired face. Edmure had aged since Jon last saw him. Lines etched his brow, and his once red hair bore streaks of gray. But he embraced Jon warmly, then clasped Brienne's hand in gratitude. "You arrived just in time," he said. "I feared these mercenaries would ravage the Riverlands anew. The small folk have suffered enough." Jon nodded. Brienne's men did most of the work. Then the Vale arrived to help. "We've broken the main force at Fairmarket." Edmure exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank the Seven, and you. Come inside, please. Rest. We'll talk more over supper." They followed him into Riverrun's main hall, a spacious chamber where tapestries of House Tully's trout insignia hung from the walls. The air was warmer here, and the smell of baked bread drifted from the kitchens. For a moment, Jon felt a pang of nostalgia. This place reminded him of stories he'd heard about the times when the Starks and Tullys were closely allied through marriage. Catelyn Stark had once walked these halls. At supper, they gathered around a long wooden table laden with bread, cheese, salted fish, and a stew of local vegetables. It wasn't a feast, but it was hearty enough to fill hungry bellies. Demure sat at the head, flanked by his wife and a few key advisors. Brienne and Jon took seats nearby. The conversation turned quickly to the realm's problems. "The brigands you faced at Fairmarket may only be the tip of the spear," Edmure said, pushing aside his bowl. "I've heard rumors of roving bands further south, near the borders of the Reach. They call themselves the Lion's Roar, a group of die-hard Lannister loyalists who claim a distant cousin of Tywin Lannister still lives and plans to reclaim the Westerlands." Jon exchanged a worried look with Brienne. "We've heard similar tales, and it's not just the Westerlands. The Crownlands near King's Landing are in disarray. No one truly rules there now. The city might still be rebuilding, but the farmland around it is lawless. Then there's the Stormlands without a recognized lord. All of it is a breeding ground for chaos." Edmure ran a hand through his graying hair. "We need a central authority. The Targaryen name once held the realm together, but after Daenerys, there's little trust." Jon's stomach tightened. He had known this question would arise eventually, and Edmure had put it succinctly. The realm needed a recognized leader, yet the memory of King's Landing's destruction still haunted everyone. Could he step into that role without igniting more distrust? Would House Martell's endorsement, plus the North's support, be enough? Brienne cleared her throat. We've formed alliances with Dorne and with many in the north. The Vale cooperates. We're negotiating with the Reach. If we present a united front, perhaps the Crownlands and the Westerlands will fall in line. Edmure considered. But you have no official seat in King's Landing, do you? And the Iron Throne destroyed. The Red Keep partly in ruins. Rebuilding a capital from scratch would require massive resources. Jon spoke quietly. We may not need a single capital or a single throne. We need a council, one that truly represents the major regions. A High Council of Lords, perhaps, meeting regularly to decide matters of law, trade, and defense. I don't want to impose a king over everyone who resents it. Edmure tapped his fingers on the table. A council might work, but it must have authority. People respect crowns, names, tradition, especially in a land so steeped in them. If you can rally enough houses to stand behind a new system, it could become tradition in its own right. But it will take time. Brienne set down her cup. Time we don't have if these brigands continue to spread. Silence fell over the table. Outside, the river's current murmured softly. Finally, Edmure exhaled, looking at Jon. You have House Tully's support, for whatever that's worth. If I'm asked to sit on a high council, I will. The riverlands will do our part. Gratitude washed through Jon, though it was tempered by the enormity of the task. Thank you, Lord Tully. That night, he found himself again pacing in his guest chamber. The day's events replayed in his mind. Each victory seemed to reveal a new wave of challenges. Glancing out the narrow window at the moonlit river, he wondered if the realm would ever truly know peace. Yet he also sensed a shifting momentum. By forging alliances, responding to crises, and standing by houses like Tully, they were weaving the threads of a new tapestry. Could they gather enough strands, enough great houses, to create something unbreakable? Could a realm that had seen dragons and White Walkers unify under a council, or under a monarch who ruled by the people's consent rather than raw power? Jon thought of Rhaegar Targaryen, of the tragic path his father had taken. He thought of Daenerys, whose good intentions had ended in ash. He thought of Eddard Stark, the man who raised him, who believed in honor above all else. If Jon could bring that Stark honor together with the Targaryen capacity for unification, without the madness, maybe the realm had a chance. Early the next morning, after final consultations with Edmure, Jon and Brienne prepared to return to Fairmarket to finish the cleanup and then journey homeward. Before he left, Edmure pulled him aside in a quiet hallway, where a tapestry of a leaping trout hung. Jon, Edmure said, voice low, I didn't want to raise this at supper last night, but there are rumors circulating that some houses in the Westerlands are rallying around a supposed Lannister heir, a boy claiming to be a nephew of Cersei. It might be nonsense, or it might not. Jon's shoulders tensed. I'd heard mention of a rumor like that once, but nothing concrete. Do you give it credence? Edmure frowned. Hard to say, but if enough people believe it or choose to believe it, we may have another claimant to the throne. Another war for the Iron Throne. What's left of it? Jon felt a flicker of dread. The last thing we need is another pretender drawing the discontented lords to his banner. Exactly. So watch your back. If you try to unify the realm under a new system, this boy, real or not, could become a figurehead for resistance. Jon nodded, though his stomach churned. Thank you for the warning. They left Riverrun with heavier hearts. Rumors of a Lannister pretender might remain rumors, or they might coalesce into a genuine threat. If so, the realm would face yet another civil war, pitting Targaryen alliances against Lannister loyalists. Jon vowed to do everything in his power to prevent that. For too long, the realm had been torn by the ambitions of houses bent on wearing a crown. He would not see it burn again. Fairmarket was calmer upon their return, with Davos and Ed finishing the last duties of burying the dead and releasing the local peasants conscripted by the mercenaries. Lord Royce was preparing to depart, having done his part. Jon thanked him formally, urging him to consider joining a broader council if one were formed. Royce gave no firm commitment, but neither did he refuse, an encouraging sign. At last, Jon, Davos, Ed, Brienne, and the remnants of their combined force parted ways. Brienne and a few knights would remain briefly to aid Lord Tully, while Jon, Davos, and Ed led the northern contingent back home. They carried with them not only the taste of victory but also the bitter knowledge of how fragile the realm remained. The road north was long, giving Jon ample time to contemplate the next steps. He asked Davos for his thoughts on forming a high council. The Onion Knight scratched his beard, saying, "It's a bold plan, lad. If it works, it might just save us all. But you'll face pushback from lords who want a king they can manipulate, or from pretenders who want to be that king. You'll need unwavering allies. Dorne is one. The Tullys are another. The Vale seems amenable. If the Reach joins, that might be enough critical mass to overshadow any pretender." "And the North?" Jon asked quietly. Davos gave him a sidelong look. "They'll follow you, Jon. But you need to keep reassuring them you're still their Stark, not just a Targaryen wearing a wolf's skin." Jon sighed, thinking of Lord Glover's stubbornness. "I know." They pressed on, crossing the Neck, passing Moat Cailin, and eventually sighting the familiar ramparts of Winterfell under a cold, gray sky. Sansa came out to greet them, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension as she took in the reduced number of men riding behind Jon. She asked few questions at first, simply welcoming them home. That evening, by the warmth of the Great Hall's fire, Jon recounted the events at Fairmarket. The sabotage, the Vale's arrival, the final victory. Sansa listened intently, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. When he mentioned the rumors of a Lannister heir, her expression turned grim. "So it begins again?" she said softly. "Another pretender with a golden lion on his banners?" Jon spread his hands. "We don't know if he even exists truly, but the rumor alone can spark trouble. We have to solidify our alliances quickly, or any spark could ignite a new war." Sansa nodded slowly. "Then let's set about doing just that. We have some news ourselves. House Manderley has improved White Harbor's defenses, and there's talk of establishing a more permanent trade route between there and Sunspear. Lord Manderley wants to meet you to discuss deeper coordination with Dorne. Also, Gendry Baratheon, if that's who he still calls himself, apparently surfaced near King's Landing, forging weapons for a mercantile guild. There's a rumor he might have accepted an invitation to meet with the Stormlander lords. Could be a path to uniting the Stormlands." Jon's eyes lit with cautious hope. If Gendry can rally the Stormlands, that removes another major obstacle. At least it would end the leadership void. She nodded. "Yes, and I received a raven from Prince Trystane Martell. He invites you to Sunspear to discuss the next phase of our great alliance, as he puts it." Jon took a breath, letting the pieces of the puzzle settle. "We might be nearing a critical juncture. If we're to propose a high council to the realm, we can't do it from the north alone. We need to gather Dorne, the Reach, the Vale, the Riverlands, and as many others as we can manage." Sansa leaned forward. "You mean a grand assembly like a great council of old? But instead of choosing a king, we'd propose a new system." "Precisely," Jon said, "though we must tread carefully. Many will still want a monarch. Some might demand I take it or might oppose me as a Targaryen. We have to navigate that." Sansa folded her arms. "If we can show them a functioning alliance, with each region fairly represented, perhaps that will be more attractive than backing a questionable king." Jon nodded, though a shiver of uncertainty ran through him. "We'll have to put it all on the table and see who stands with us. We can't force them without risking another war." Their conversation stretched into the late hours, exploring the logistics of such a council, potential meeting places. Neutral ground might be best, perhaps Harrenhal or even Old Town, and who should be invited first. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them, and they parted ways. But as Jon made for his chamber, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had a plan, ambitious, risky, but perhaps the only way to save Westeros from perpetual strife. In the days that followed, letters flew across the realm under the Stark Targaryen seal. Sansa wrote meticulously, inviting lords from all corners to consider the formation of a high council. Jon penned personal appeals to Prince Trystane, Lord Tully, Lord Royce, and the lesser lords of the Reach. He also requested an audience with Gendry Baratheon, asking for a chance to speak of the Stormlands' future. Each missive carried the same core message: unity for the sake of rebuilding, forging laws and policies collectively, and ending the cycle of war. The response was slow at first. Doubts, questions, outright refusals from some. But pockets of interest appeared. Many lords, exhausted by war, expressed cautious optimism. Others, particularly those who had suffered under the Lannisters or Targaryens, wondered if this might finally bring them security. The cynics questioned whether such a council could hold power without a throne. Jon replied with honesty: they would have to make it hold power by standing together. And so the seeds of a great council were sown. With the harvest approaching in the north, Jon and Sansa made plans for travel. They decided to split their efforts. Sansa would remain in the north to ensure stability among the more stubborn houses, continuing to bolster ties with the Vale and White Harbor. Jon would go south again, first to meet Prince Trystane in Dorne, then possibly to the Reach or even King's Landing if necessary. Davos and Ed, reluctant to see him go, once more pledged to follow. Ghost, of course, would remain at Jon's side. Just before he departed, a raven arrived from Dorne, carrying a personal message from Illyria Sand. The gist was clear. Prince Trystane stood ready to move forward with the alliance, but other Dornish lords needed reassurance that a council of equals would not lead to their region being overshadowed by northern interests. Jon understood their concerns. He penned a reply, promising that if any region threatened to dominate the others, the council would fail and all efforts would crumble. Balance was key. On the appointed morning, Jon prepared to leave Winterfell once again. He stood in the courtyard as Sansa, Brienne, who had returned from Riverrun, and several northern lords gathered to see him off. The air carried the tang of oncoming autumn, a reminder that the days were shortening. Jon donned a sturdy cloak, the Stark sigil embroidered over his left breast and a faint Targaryen dragon over his right. A symbolic union that many in the north still eyed with mixed feelings. Sansa hugged him tight. "Be safe," she whispered. "This might be your most important journey yet." Jon smiled ruefully, returning her embrace. "I'll do my best. Keep the north together. We'll need our home strong if this council is to have any weight." She nodded, stepping back. Ghost stood at Jon's side, quiet but watchful. Davos, already mounted, lifted a hand in greeting. Ed was on another horse, looking as though he'd rather be cleaning out a stable than riding south again. A dozen well-armed men rode with them, volunteers who believed in Jon's cause. And so they set forth, clattering through Winterfell's gates and onto the King's Road. It struck Jon how differently he felt this time compared to his last journey to Dorne. Then, he had been uncertain, burdened by the guilt of all that had come before. Now, the burden remained, but it was tempered by a sense of direction. The Great Council was no longer just an idea. It was taking shape in letters and forging alliances. The realm might be on the brink of something new. As they rode, Jon gazed at the horizon. The road curved ahead, leading south through the wide expanses of the north, eventually narrowing into the neck, then opening into the fertile lands beyond. Beyond that lay the scorching deserts of Dorne. And beyond even that, perhaps, lay a new future for Westeros, a tapestry of once rival houses working side by side. He dared to imagine a day when no child would grow up hearing the horns of war or see their fields trampled by armies. Yes, there were countless obstacles still. Rumors of a Lannister pretender, the uncertain stance of the Iron Islands, the Ironborn raiders who might sabotage trade, the bitterness of certain northern lords, and the scars left by Daenerys' final days. But each step forward built momentum. Each alliance woven made the tapestry stronger. Jon urged his horse into a steady canter. Ghost loped ahead, sniffing the breeze. The entourage followed, a modest band carrying the hopes of a weary kingdom. Whether the realm would seize this chance or slip back into chaos remained an open question. Yet, for the first time in living memory, houses from Dorne to the north aligned, however tenuously, in the pursuit of rebuilding. Jon Snow clung to that hope, fueling each mile of his journey. If they succeeded, future generations might remember this alliance of wolf and son, of Targaryen, Martell, Stark, Tully, Royce, and countless others, as the foundation upon which a new Westeros arose. A realm where old grudges finally gave way to a shared vision. A realm that no longer needed the Iron Throne to hold it together. A realm that, at long last, could look upon its scars and see not the promise of more bloodshed, but the promise of rebirth. And so he rode on, resolute, a quiet promise in his heart. He would not rest until Westeros could truly call itself united. A single man could not rebuild an entire kingdom alone, but with allies, with faith, and with unyielding resolve, they might yet forge a peace that neither dragons nor white winds could tear apart.